In this video, we're going to talk about how lighting affects color. More specifically, how the light coming from your south-facing windows impact the paint colors you choose. Interior design is complicated. I'm sorry to say, but picking the right color isn't just about going with the one that looks nicest online or even at your local paint store. What really matters is how the color is going to look in the room that you plan on using it in. Not only do you have to factor in your flooring, furniture, decor, but your lighting is one of the most important yet overlooked factors when putting together your color palette. As part of our lighting exposure series, this is the fourth one we're looking at. We've gone over east, west, north. Today's topic is all about southern exposures. Is it southern or southern? I guess it's southern if I'm from the south, right? Okay, let's not get into pronunciations just for this video, please. But what we can do though is like this video, which is not as entertaining, but way more helpful for our growth. Let's get into this. Southern exposures are rooms with south-facing windows, and they behave in a very specific way. They're actually one of the easiest exposures to work with when picking color, so you really don't need to be concerned at all. In fact, you should just be celebrating with a big old bottle of wine because south-facing windows and that kind of lighting is actually super easy to deal with. Now, click over here if you want to watch. I'm just kidding, okay? We do need to talk about this in a little more detail. There are some things that you really need to consider when you're picking colors in those south-facing rooms, because even though they are easier than some of the other exposures, there's a lot of considerations to make. In fact, one of the main distinguishing factors of south-facing windows is the fact that there aren't going to be a whole lot of drastic changes in your lighting throughout the day, especially when we're talking about color temperature. This is already a huge difference from the other exposures where you might select a color based on which time of day you're going to be using that room, because the color will likely change quite considerably from morning till night. With rooms that have south-facing windows, you don't necessarily get that as much. One of the big advantages here is your design in general should feel a little more consistent from one hour to the next, and this means a bit less planning is required on your part. For example, if you're looking for a color to paint your kitchen with, you don't need to choose between a great breakfast time color versus an awesome afternoon snack binge color. I like my snacks. South-facing rooms won't look too drastically different in either case, which is a huge plus. The question is, how are those colors going to look in general? Well, if you think about how northern exposures tend to work, those give you a general cooler color cast, and southern exposures, being the opposite of that, will give you an overall color palette that is slightly warmer. Now, it depends on who you ask, but for most people, warmer colors tend to signify an increased feeling of comfort and safety and coziness. So these are all things that you would probably like to portray in your home base. But I will say that even though this is generally positive news, you need to be aware of this warmer natural lighting that you'll be getting, because that will have a pretty big impact on certain colors. For example, if you're picking a warm color to start with because you like warmth, just be careful you don't go too far in that direction, because the added warm natural light will enhance that, turning a pleasant warm neutral color, for example, into a slightly fiery color that just feels a bit too much. On the other hand, some cooler leaning colors may feel a bit closer to a true neutral, or neutral grays will feel a bit warmer than usual in those south-facing rooms. More often than not, however, a color leaning warmer tends to be more visually acceptable than one leaning cooler, just because of how interior design has been developing over the years. Definitely not a hard and fast rule. This is all open to interpretation and preference. But when you consider wood just on its own, most wood is warmer leaning, and that's a material that is likely going to be popping up somewhere in your decor, which means that it's actually going to work better with warmer leaning colors anyway. South-facing light also doesn't change a whole lot throughout the day, like we mentioned before. Because it's generally warm from dawn till dusk, the color temperature won't shift a whole lot. What does change, however, is the intensity of the light. So around noon, that light is going to be quite bright and will fill your space with dim rays. That's the main change that happens here. You're going to get a lot more of that warmer light around lunchtime, but not a ton of change in color temperature throughout the day. So because you don't need to worry about the time of day as much, what we can instead talk about is the quality of light coming through your south-facing windows. you can start to consider how much of that warmer leaning light is coming in and impacting the overall color palette. Obviously, if you have a ton of it, then I would recommend picking colors that are a bit darker, believe it or not, maybe anything under 70 light reflectance value. Some people may be tempted to double down on opening up their space with a nice, light, bright color in a well-lit room, but what ends up happening is those off-whites on your walls will really start to feel overly bright. And it doesn't matter how fun and nuanced the undertones are, you won't really see any of them. They're just gonna be gone. This is why I opt for lighter midtones in those situations, usually, because they'll have more substance. The contrast will be more clear on your trim and woodwork, and they'll help maintain some of that visual depth. But really, if you have a lot of that nice warm southern light coming in, then you can afford to go even darker, maybe under 50 LRV even, and that gives you even more options in your design. You don't necessarily need to be limited to those lighter neutral colors that we all seem to gravitate towards. And also, on the subject of light versus dark colors to open up a space, it's actually a common misconception that light colors make a space feel bigger. It's actually those darker wall colors that give you the illusion of a more expansive or receding wall. So by going with a darker midtone in this case, your space will feel bigger, but also still fairly bright because of those awesome south-facing windows. You could also afford to go even darker and go beyond midtones into the 20s and 30s on the light reflectance value scale. And although I wouldn't recommend that for everyone, you certainly have the option to do so in this case. Another fun aspect of south-facing windows is you do have the option to pick paint colors that are perhaps a bit cooler than you would normally be used to. No matter how saturated the color is, just be aware that it's likely going to feel a little bit warmer in those south-facing rooms because of that natural light. So if you wanted a color that feels like a true gray, then you probably wouldn't pick a quote-unquote true gray paint color. Maybe you'd start with something that's just a tad cool leaning so that it would balance out into a neutral gray once that sun hits it. For those of you that technically have a south-facing room, but maybe not a lot of south-facing light coming in, then the same rules apply, but to a much lesser extent. You'll still get that nice warm glow coming in, but maybe only in certain areas, or to a lesser degree overall. In that case, it then largely becomes dependent on what type of artificial lighting you're using to supplement that. And it may be a good idea to try and find some of those warmer leaning light bulbs, or at the very least, neutral white ones, so you're not having a ton of light mixing happening in the space. Just as a bit of a side note, I have seen different types of light bulbs working within a room, especially if you have that 5000 Kelvin overhead lighting to illuminate the space and providing the most amount of light, and then having maybe one or two warmer incandescent floor lamps as accent lights. So there is definitely a way of doing things. But in general, as a starting point, it's always easiest to just keep your interior lighting as consistent as you can, and just try and keep it all even. Out of the 4 lighting exposures, I think this is the only time where I actually brought up interior artificial lighting. And that's because there really isn't too much complexity with south-facing natural light. Just know the important fundamentals here. Warm lighting consistently throughout the day that is at its brightest around lunchtime. Also, if we hit 100 likes, I'll post my 5 south-facing color choices next week for you all. If you're looking for color choices for the other side of your house facing north, this is all you need to know about north-facing exposures and how they affect color. I find northern exposures to be a bit trickier to deal with, but it's not as daunting as you think, so I hope you enjoy that video. And thanks for watching this one. Bye.